Today marks the 40th anniversary of the deadliest aviation accident in history. It happened on the small Spanish island of Tenerife off the coast of West Africa. Two jumbo jets, one American, collided on March 27, 1977. Jeff Glor spoke with a survivor of the deadly crash and looks at how the factors that caused it are still relevant today. Jeff, good morning.
Charlie, good morning to you. The unusual events and errors that led to this disaster are almost too hard to believe, even 40 years later. An act of terror at a different airport, miscommunication, weather, and a pilot's mistake. 583 people died, but 61 survived. Some are still with us today. They are typically very reluctant to speak, unless they believe it can help. 4 decades ago, Tenerife, the picturesque, quiet Spanish Canary Islands, suddenly home to the worst airline accident the world had ever seen, both then and now.
Historically, it's an accident with an almost mythical kind of aura around it.
Patrick Smith is a commercial airline pilot and author who has studied Tenerife extensively.
Where that comes from, I think, is partly the bizarre cascading series of ironies and coincidences that led to it happening, beginning with the fact that neither of these two planes was supposed to be at Tenerife in the first place.
Shifted to Tenerife by a global threat that still haunts the industry.
The Pan Am and KLM jumbo jets were diverted to Tenerife yesterday after a terrorist bomb explosion at the Canary Islands main airport in Las Palmas.
Two 747s ended up on an infrequently used runway. As both planes waited for several hours, an unusually dense fog descended. Eventually, the tower sent a message to a KLM flight to taxi to the end of the runway and turn around. Then instructed a Pan Am flight to follow. The KLM jet got into position and announced they were ready to go.
Pan Am pilots heard this, became startled, clicked their mic to say, hey, we're still on the runway.
Because of radio interference, the KLM plane didn't get that message. The pilot, thinking he was cleared for takeoff, sent his plane rocketing down the runway, where the Pan Am plane was still taxiing. Bob Bragg, the first officer of the Pan Am flight, spoke to CBS News in 2000.
As soon as I saw the man moving and coming at us, I started saying, get off. As we were turning to the left, I looked back out of my side window, and that's when he had lifted off the ground and become airborne, right as close to us as I could see him.
The KLM plane wasn't high enough. On contact, it burst into flames and tore the top of the Pan Am jet clear off. Everyone aboard the KLM flight was killed. But inside the Pan Am flight, some remained alive. You haven't talked about this publicly in almost 40 years.
Right.
I wonder what you're thinking here as the anniversary arrives.
How fortunate I am.
Including Joan Feathers, who we found outside Phoenix just last week.
I sat there thinking this is the end. So as we made our way to the side of the plane, all these little implosions of fire, I just felt that it was imminent. I did not want to burn up. So there was a doctor from Chicago that had been in the plane, and he was down below, and he said, jump, I'll catch you.
What did you see when you looked around?
I could tell that there was a lot of these little fires that were getting bigger. So I kept running, and it wasn't maybe 15 seconds, and the plane went up like an atom bomb. It just, and then huge fire.
Investigators pinned most of the blame on the KLM pilot, Jacob Van Zanten, who was considered such an exceptional flyer. He was the face of the company.
He was on KLM billboards, in KLM advertisements. One of the famous little nuggets of the story is that when word got back to KLM that one of their planes had crashed, they went looking for Captain Van Zanten to go to the scene to figure out what happened, unaware that he was actually the captain.
The Tenerife disaster, the worst in aviation history, remains relevant today.
We've engineered away what used to be the causes of some of the worst crashes ever. But this one, I think the fundamental cause or causes are really still there.
That means crowded runways. It means potential pilot error. What else?
Runway congestion, air traffic control, communications issues, things like that. Those problems are still out there. There's not a crisis, but we shouldn't be complacent about that.
As for Joan Feathers, she's never stopped thinking about Tenerife.
So every year on March 27th, I remember, and it's as if it happened not long ago.
Do you think about it on every time you fly?
Every time you fly.
As Patrick Smith rightly points out, flying today has never been safer. The improvements made since the 70s and 80s have been vast and measurable. That said, communication and congestion issues still come up.
And she still gets on a plane and flies.
She still gets on a plane, yet she says sometimes she sits next to what she calls a white-knuckled flyer, somebody who's very nervous.
Yeah.
And she doesn't tell them the story typically,
Yeah,
but she says that if you only knew.
That's so heartbreaking, though, Jeff. A series of things could have prevented that. And
Yeah.
the fact that it happened on the ground, too, is also very frightening
And what's
to
the
me.
most alarming thing that they have not fixed?
Well, the radio frequencies, I mean, the communication issues that come up when they send messages between tower and pilot, sometimes if they happen at the same time, they don't hear. That's one of the many issues that happened back then 40 years ago.
Jeff, thank you.
Sure.